community starts attributing the daily horrors of their lives to a mythical figure.
From the incredible imagination of Clive Barker
Candyman, get me.
comes a living,
They ain't never gonna catch him.
breathing
He's under the bed!
terror. Candyman. You don't have to believe. Just beware. Candyman. Rated R. Starts Friday, October 16th at a theater near you.
And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your, hopefully, happy hump day, early evening here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So today is a little bit of a dual, not celebration, not really episode, but today is the 6th entry of our continuing month-long series called Halloween Horror. And the first 5 entries, not in any order, An American Werewolf in London, The Blair Witch Project, The Exorcist, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre OG 1974, and The Wicker Man OG 1973. Well, the 6th entry is a movie that coincidentally celebrates its 32nd year today. Released on October 16, 1992, Bernard Rose's stupendous adaptation of a not very good Clive Barker short story called The Forbidden. And Clive Barker, you know, he's often known as the British Stephen King, and that is not very far-fetched. Clive Barker is a genius. He's also a fine filmmaker. But The Forbidden is not a very good story. I've read it. And I have no idea how Bernard Rose managed to kind of conjure up Candyman, how he had the idea, because the short story, maybe 25% of it ends up in the film. There were so many flights of fancy and ingenious concepts that Rose came up with on his own. It's like magic. And he made horror movie magic. And I believe that Candyman is one of the best, most original horror films of its kind, of what I would call pure horror, where you have a supernatural entity wreaking havoc, as opposed to, not that there's anything wrong with the kind of grounded Silence of the Lambs, or even a film which gets into a little bit of supernatural fuckery like Get Out, or that sort of horror film. But to me, horror has either alien or supernatural element, or sometimes both. And what Candyman does, and the late, great Pulitzer Prize-winning film critic Roger Ebert, who was a fan of the film, what he said about it is so accurate. And not surprisingly, after seeing Candyman for the first time, I immediately checked out Roger Ebert's review. And what he said that was so on point, he said, yes, Candyman has moments of gore, as you would expect from this kind of horror film. He said, what I like about Bernard Rose, and Roger Ebert had been a fan of a previous Bernard Rose film starring, it looked like she was going to have a bigger career than she did, Emily Lloyd, and Kiefer Sutherland. He made a film, a very interesting gangster film that it was approached from a very bizarre angle called Chicago Joe and the Showgirl. And so Ebert also liked Bernard Rose because he had done a horror film in 1988 called Paper House. So when Ebert presumably saw the previews for Candyman, oh, it's just going to be another, and his great quote, dead teenager movie, he was the guy who coined the phrase dead teenager movies to describe Friday the 13th, the later Halloween films, Nightmare on Elm Street. They're just dead teenager movies. And as Roger also said, all of our friends are dead. There are no phones, no adults, no escape. Let's take off all of our clothes and have sex. Dead teenager movies, like they deserve to die because they're so fucking stupid. But Ebert, when talking about Candyman and mentioning how much he had enjoyed Bernard Rose's Paper House, which doesn't seem like it's going to be a horror film, but more or less is, he said, I like that Rose is scaring us with ideas and gore rather than just gore. That there's more going on here, and the film takes the time, because the short story doesn't even really do this, but the film takes the time to create the mythology of the title character. He is not just this random being who exists just to kill people, and that's how he exists. The backstory is actually very rich and intriguing, fascinating, and this is one of the problems that I had with the sequel, Candyman 2. The elements were in place to really do justice to the character and give you a real sequel, and they just didn't do it. It was like the studio was only looking at the sequel as a cash grab, and they just weren't interested in taking what was so much terrific character development and to make you understand, not that you're on board with Candyman's shenanigans, his murderous shenanigans, if in fact that's what happens. So the movie Candyman works both ways. You can see it as the character who was, as a human, Daniel Robitaille, who turns into the Candyman, or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he is simply, maybe there is some kind of enchantment, or maybe people, like in the movie Smile, they start to lose their mind, and you say, well, is there some supernatural force, or is some kind of enchantment going on, like Blair Witch Project? How do they keep walking south and end up in the same place where they started? They're in a fucking forest. They're in the woods. If you keep walking south, you can't end up where you were 24 hours ago. Doesn't work that way. But Candyman creates this mythology. It creates this really amazing character, and beautifully acted by who was a theater performer named Tony Todd. And then, of course, he ended up in a lot of other horror films. He had a kind of funny cameo in Final Destination with Ali Larter, who was the star of that film. And he was in Wishmaster. And he also, in a non-horror role, he's really sorry, I'm just holding my hand up because of the sun. You don't want me to go blind here, then it'd be a different kind of horror film. But he was in the movie The Rock. That's the Michael Bay action extravaganza with Sean Connery, Nicolas Cage, and Ed Harris as kind of the bad guy who is an understandable bad guy. And he's really good. And he also was in Platoon 10 years prior, the Oliver Stone film, of course, starring Charlie Sheen, Tom Berenger, Willem Dafoe, John C. McGinley, and a very young Johnny Depp. And Tony Todd is one of those people who is such a distinctive actor. He has an incredible speaking voice. He has the screen presence of the theatrical performer because he was very successful on stage. But the voice, you almost couldn't have found a better actor for this particular role of Candyman, because the kind of scary rasp that he uses, it is sweetened. They sweetened it in post, and by sweetened meaning they added some kind of effects to make the voice sound even more menacing. But it is a great movie, and the way that Bernard Rose chooses to unspool his narrative is not what you expect. And this is a film that took me hugely by surprise, because honestly, I remember seeing the previews for this film when I was still in high school, circa May, June 1992. You know, you go to the movies and you watch a trailer for an upcoming film. And I didn't know Bernard Rose. I had not seen Paper House. I remember Chicago Joe and the Showgirl being advertised, but I never saw it. And it just looked like a standard issue dead teenager movie, or just a regular slasher film. So I wasn't really that keen to see it until it came out. And there were enough critics that were saying different things, like, this is the scariest film since Silence of the Lambs. This is more than what you're expecting. And then I happened to see Roger Ebert's review on television, where he gave the film not even just thumbs up all the way. Really liked it. I don't think Siskel liked it, but then again, Gene Siskel actually gave thumbs down to Silence of the Lambs. So, you know, what are you going to do? Just as Roger Ebert gave thumbs down to Blue Velvet, while Siskel said this might be the best film of its kind since Psycho, which was already a quarter of a century earlier. But what Rose chose to do, and this is where the surprise, where the preview for the film might get a certain kind of crowd, because the film was a box office success, but the preview, with the emphasis on the slasher film aspects, may have gotten fannies in seats. But the movie is so much more than that, and my guess is that Bernard Rose could not have been happy with the way the film was marketed, because it made it seem like it was a garden variety Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Halloween 3, Halloween 4, Halloween 5, etc., when there was so much more. And if you actually watch the film, and this is not really a spoiler, it develops in the manner of a detective story. In its own way, like my single favorite horror film, Angel Heart from 1987, the Sir Alan Parker detective story with Mickey Rourke and, of course, Mr. De Niro and Lisa Bonet and Charlotte Rampling and Dan Florek. Just a terrific supporting cast in that film. But that movie sets itself up as a private eye story. Mickey Rourke is a private eye, and he's looking for a missing lounge singer, and it's very, very street level, above board, and then all of a sudden it takes a descent into the supernatural. Well, we get the idea that Candyman has supernatural elements right from the start, within 2 minutes. I mean, you could even argue right within the opening credits when you hear Candyman's voice, and Tony Todd's line readings are so amazing, even in those early sequences. Candyman unfolds like a detective story, like Mickey Rourke as Harold Angel trying to find Johnny Favorite, and the first hour of the film is very straightforward. Where is this guy? Who was this guy? Is he dead? Is he alive? What's going on here? In the world of Candyman, and I don't really believe necessarily that Bernard Rose, he may have been a fan of Angel Heart, but I don't think he was purposely saying, oh, I'm going to do this like Alan Parker did in Angel Heart. But the character of Helen Lyle, and that's Virginia Madsen, who a decade or so later ended up getting an Oscar nomination for her wonderful supporting turn in Alexander Payne's Sideways, a movie I absolutely love. Virginia Madsen is the star of Candyman, and she plays a researcher at what I think is supposed to be Northwestern. I don't think it's Chicago University, but it's a big school near kind of central downtown Chicago. It's in the area of that. And she is researching urban legends and urban folklore and myth making. And she becomes somewhat obsessed with, but more from the perspective of, she has a thesis to write, and she's a doctoral candidate, and she's going to give it everything she's got. So she's not like obsessed to the point where she can't be reasoned with, but this is what she wants to do. So she starts researching the legend of Candyman, who supposedly haunts, and she thinks it's all a crock of shit, this true life, horrendous housing project not far from Chicago called Cabrini Green. Now, Cabrini Green is a real place. In fact, a decade later, the Keanu Reeves film, which is okay, it's not great. It was a movie that Keanu made, I believe, just before shooting the 2 Matrix sequels. I'm not 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure he shot them like within a month of going to do the Matrix sequels. But he did this movie Hardball, and it is also set in and around Cabrini Green, which was disbanded and torn down and razed not long after the movie Hardball. But setting Candyman near Cabrini Green and having many sequences in this just disgusting housing project, crawling with drug dealers, crawling with murder. It's just awful. And the thematic element is there anything that a supernatural killer can do to these people that's worse than the fucking hellhole they're living in anyway? And that would seem to be on the nose, but in the world of the movie, it works beautifully. So Helen Lyle does regular, old school, hands-on research, microfilm, microfiche, regular interviews with people talking about the legend of Candyman, some of whom think it's a crock, but they're telling her a story, and others who think, no, this is real. There is really a Candyman, and he has committed murders. So she basically proves that it's a myth. She proves that there is no celestial entity, a murderous being called Candyman. She proves it. And that's the detective story aspect of Candyman. Because when the real Candyman comes calling, now we enter the realm of the supernatural. But the thing is, it's always been there. It's just that the character of Helen Lyle doesn't believe. And that's the whole conceptual masterstroke of this. It's that Candyman needs believers to exist. He won't let her get away with disproving him. Hey, I'm here. and I'm going to fuck shit up. You didn't believe in me? Well, here I am. Here I am. And then it goes from there, and I'm not going to spoil any further because this is another one of those movies. If you haven't seen it, it is better than you think. And I won't say it's better than its reputation, because if you go on Rotten Tomatoes, it is a very high score for this sort of horror film. Certainly a higher quality horror film than really any of the Friday the 13th, any of the Nightmare on Elm Streets, and any of the Halloween movies, except for the first one, which is an absolute masterpiece. And that is not an exaggeration. You could say that it might be John Carpenter, a great filmmaker. It could be his finest film, and he certainly made a lot of movies I love. I mean, I'm an enormous fan of Starman. But Candyman is a film, despite the gore. I remember when I saw it, I thought it could have, and please don't judge me, or I don't really give a shit if you do judge me, I thought it could have been nominated for Best Picture in 1992. That is how great of a film I think this is. It goes for high art, even within the gore, and I feel like it succeeds brilliantly. It's just great all the way through. The jump scares work, and Rose, his editing techniques, there's no CGI. At least I'm pretty sure there is no CGI. All of the special effects are mechanical effects done during production, practical effects, and then there are some editing techniques that Rose uses that make it feel like we're watching a special effect and we're not. Really, really great stuff. Like, there's a moment in the film, this is a mild spoiler, there's a moment in the film where a character jumps onto a bed, and it is an unbelievable jump scare. And I've rewound it in the days of VHS. I rewound this one moment over and over to try to figure out how Bernard Rose achieved this effect, and I still don't know how he did it. And that, to me, is as good as you can do when somebody who actually knows what he's looking at and is interested cannot figure out how you achieved a certain shot. You got something. And I have no idea how he achieved that shot. Was there, I assume there's a hydraulic, but I don't know that. I couldn't find any information anywhere. So when the film goes into the supernatural, it's the sort of movie that it leaves us with a lot of questions. And mostly dealing with the character of Helen Lyle. And Virginia Madsen, it could be a throwaway role, but she puts so much of herself into this character that it's not a movie star performance. And you could say, well, I mean, Virginia Madsen was never really a movie star, but in this film, she is in virtually every scene. This is a movie star role. And I feel like she was perfectly cast because, yes, she's very striking, but her line readings are solid, and her character is not what you expect. She is not the damsel in distress. She is tough. And there are certain societal things that she counts on, and she behaves in a certain way and with a certain confidence. The confidence of somebody who has been around the block, who has seen more shit in her life than you would expect from somebody who is probably supposed to be in her late 20s, but she is not afraid. And the fact that she's not afraid plays into a lot of some of the craziness that takes place in the second half of this film. Because there are characters who repeatedly lean on her and try to intimidate her. But she's just not having it. As she says, I don't scare too easy. Almost as a threat to anybody who thinks that they're going to push her around just because she's a woman. And it's a very, I don't want to say an empowering female character, because that's a whole other thing given where this movie winds up. But it is a very strong and forceful representation of femininity in this movie, and a woman who is not going to be a pushover and walks into the lion's den repeatedly and just keeps saying, I ain't turning around. I'm not giving up. I'm doing this thesis one way or the other, and I'm getting this done. And if you think that you're going to dissuade me, you're wrong. It's really a terrific performance, and I know that this particular performance has been written about and like as a sort of underappreciated, under the radar great performance from the 90s by an actress, because usually horror films, especially films with the gore content of Candyman, they're overlooked. But she is not, to quote Sylvester Stallone, she is not just a piece in an erector set. Helen Lyle is a three-dimensional, living, breathing character. She's a woman who's married. Her husband is a professor at the university. She's a hard worker. She is tenacious. And she's just going to do whatever the hell she has to do to get to whatever her finish line is. And this movie does play with the idea of the kind of subjective versus objective reality. And you can assess this movie from a lot of different perspectives. Do you take everything at face value, that what you are presented with directly is exactly what happened? Or is this one of those stories, a little bit like a Blair Witch Project, where you don't really know exactly who's doing what to whom? You can say you know the why, but exactly who's doing what? Is this, mild spoiler for Angel Heart, where one character may be committing murders, or he may not be committing any murders, or he might be committing murders while under some form of spell or enchantment or something of that nature? And that's the kind of mystery of Candyman, which, again, Candyman 2, which had all the pieces in place, a great setting in New Orleans, they just didn't get it done. And I am a fan of the Jordan Peele-produced Nia DaCosta. It was supposed to come out in the summer of 2020, but then COVID happened, and they ended up releasing it the following year. But the Candyman reboot is not a reboot. And I highly recommend that film. It is a direct sequel to the 1992 original. And that took me by surprise in the best possible way, because I went along with what all of the pre-release chatter was and everything that Jordan Peele, who was very excited about the film, he teased Tony Todd's involvement in it and all that, and that there are some returning actors, but he kept calling it a spiritual sequel or a reboot. But I am telling you, Candyman 2021, starring the fantastic Yahya Abdel-Mateen, who was so good in Matrix Resurrections, playing a different iteration of Morpheus than the Lawrence Fishburne, the iconic Lawrence Fishburne turns in the original 3 movies. But Yahya Abdel-Mateen is fucking great in Candyman 2021. And that movie, that's the sequel, that's the kind of film that should have been made in the mid-90s. And then Candyman Day of the Dead, there wasn't even an attempt to really do anything. And it was so frustrating, because when you have somebody like Tony Todd, who always came to play, as they say, he was always going to bring it. You gotta take advantage. You gotta capitalize. You can't leave that on the table and not do everything you can to make a great movie. And as much as I can say that Candyman 2 is entertaining, it's just not as good. There's so much more that could be done, especially given the strength of the cast. And Kelly Rowan also didn't have a great career, but I thought she was very solid. And Veronica Cartwright, kind of go both ways. She's had movies where she's terrible, I thought, or her characters are terrible, like in Witches of Eastwick. But then you look at what she does in the original Alien, she's fantastic. But the original Candyman, a box office hit, but a movie that is very well regarded, and if anything, its estimation from a historical perspective has gone up. There are less people. If you go on YouTube, for example, right now, and you check out movie reactors, especially this time of year because of it's Halloween season, and you have a lot of movie reactors watching certain horror films for the first time. Any movie reactor, and some of my favorites like TBR Schmidt, Asia and BJ, they're the ones that have the Back Like We Never Left that I use. I got it from them. And Rob Squad, all of the major reactors who I follow have watched Candyman mostly for the first time, and they can't believe, how did we not see this? This is amazing. It is a great horror film. I have it in my top 5 all-time best horror films. Now, I will also preface that by saying it's not as polarizing as the Blair Witch Project 1999. I have the Blair Witch Project also in my top 5. Many fans of horror don't even like the Blair Witch Project. They think it just flat out sucks. But that's fine. That's what this is. Not film criticism, but just opinion. And looking at films from a historical perspective, sometimes there are movies that work when we're a certain age and then don't work 10 years later, and vice versa. Films that you might dismiss the first time through, like me, watching The Fisher King and thinking it wasn't any good, and Lawrence Kasdan's Grand Canyon from the same year of 1991, seeing them at age 18, And then watching them years later saying, what the hell movie did I watch? These films are both incredible. Well, I thought Candyman 1992 was top 3. I would have had it, my favorite horror films when I first saw it. And it has not moved down. It is a film that has stood the test of time because the effects work is all believable. It's not dated. The only thing dated in this movie are the cars, the hairstyle, and the clothing. Everything else, it all works. You could make the same movie today. You would just update all of the little trappings of the early 1990s. Candyman, released on this day, 1992. Adapted by Bernard Rose from a short story from Clive Barker and starring Virginia Madsen, Tony Todd, Xander Berkeley, and a whole host of really solid supporting actors. If you haven't seen it, you got to see it. It's that good. This has been episode 328 of the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your, hopefully, happy hump day early evening with me here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, Candyman, 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 Candyman. Not saying it 5 times. Peace.